hello everyone. I'm pleased to have the chance to present you information about the different policies, regulation, and programs that are efficient tools to enable energy efficiency to be introduced in different countries. So as Fernando said, my name is Pierre Landlois. I'm the president of ECOAIR, a firm that is specialized for the last 30 years in energy efficiency and has worked in over 140 countries with most of international financing institutions, bilateral institutions, and a lot of national ministries, national energy efficiency agencies, and other interested organizations in the development of clean energy and more especially energy efficiency. So the topic of my presentation today, as mentioned by Fernando, is related to the policies, regulation, and programs that are tools to implement energy efficiency. It's definitely a challenge to try to introduce the main concepts in 1 hour, but we'll try to do the best we can to cover as many subjects as possible within these 3 main topics. So the presentation is going to be divided simply into policies, regulations, and programs, and we'll start right away with policies. Well, policies basically are efficient tools that are at the startup of an energy efficiency initiative within a government. They basically express the government's long-term commitment towards more energy efficiency or carbon-free economy. And as examples of that, you would have the EU 2020 Climate and Energy Package, the so-called 2020 targets. You would have others that are basically related to white papers that gives orientations to the government. Or you would have even more specific documents that translate into laws that basically introduce within the legislation actual objective or framework as far as the country interest in introducing and caring about energy efficiency in its activities. As an example, again, we can talk about the different European directives that are basically more policies than programs. For regulations, the concept starts to be a lot more details. It means that regulations basically translate within real actions the different policies that governments have introduced. You may have regulations without having a specific energy efficiency policy, but most of the time a policy will give the tone to what the regulation should be, and then regulations will come as specific tools over time. There's one important differentiation that has to be done at the startup of talking about regulations between incentives and regulations. Well, basically in a lot of economies, especially the OECD economies and developed economies, the use of incentives has been introduced quite a lot. And incentives are basically financial tools that basically address specific barriers in the market to try to eliminate them and enable some energy efficiency projects to be introduced. So incentives can be structured as a reduction of upfront cost for projects. They can obviously reduce the payback period for improvement for investment. They will impact the return on investment. But incentives will always have a limited market penetration at some point because money that can be invested in such tools are limited. They can be very efficiently designed so they have a market transformation effect, but it's always going to be more limited than regulations, which basically regulations will focus on an administrative approach to target different aspects of an economy to change it either partly or totally. Very often when a regulation applies as a law, then it has 100% market penetration because it becomes something that the government has to do. So for example, banning incandescent lamp would be a regulation that over time will basically impact every end user because these type of lamps will not be available. Some other regulations are not as stringent. They're not as, they don't have the same penetration rate, basically because they can only address data collection, as an example, for energy integrator purposes, or other means to introduce the energy efficiency concept without actually having a real impact on their implementation of projects. As an example of current regulatory mechanism, we can talk about the standard and labeling one. Standard and labeling has been one of the most efficient tools used within the regulatory framework, as they basically touch specific equipment that are targeted as being very inefficient. They basically set the tone for an improvement over time of such efficiency, and they basically have an objective to remove the inefficient products of the market altogether by banning the use or the sales of some that are the mostly inefficient. They will promote, obviously, the development of efficient technologies over time, so they will always be moving up the minimum requirement, and if it's standard, will basically oblige the manufacturer to develop more efficient technologies, not only as a minimum, but also as additional efficiencies that will be recognized through a standard. Standard might be voluntary or mandatory. So if they're voluntary, that means essentially that each equipment may conform with a specific standard. As mandatory would mean that it would be enforced in a country, and some type of equipment that are not very efficient will be totally banned for sales. Labels on their side will basically provide needed information by the consumer, so when they make the choices to buy an equipment, they will be able to make a choice based on information that will have to be provided to them. So you will have an endorsement aspect, so you may have, you may be recognized through a label, but it also enables the purchaser, the person who's going to buy the equipment, to basically compare efficiency and include that in their selection process. And as we saw over the years, and standards have been implemented for a long time, and they prove to be, if not the most, certainly one of the most efficient tools on the regulatory framework, because they basically change altogether the market, the market composition of the equipment. And as we saw from this slide from CLASP, which is an organization in the U.S. and NGO that's the most specialized in promoting the use of standards and labeling, we saw that standards definitely have an impact, a direct impact of the efficiency, of the global efficiency of a market, and it induced basically an increase of efficiency as soon as they're introduced. One of the things about standard is they have to evolve in time, so they cannot be static, as basically if they become static, all the market will adjust to this minimum requirement, but may not improve over time, as a standard usually has a global objective of always increasing the global efficiency. So it means that standards will have to be reevaluated over time. So that curve that we see here that is basically declining will always move up the efficiency. So the number sold of new equipment will always increase and not decrease, as we see here, because at some point when the new equipment is introduced and people want to buy more efficient equipment, at some point these equipment last for a long time and their sales drop. As we have new equipment coming in, well, the sales will probably pick up, efficiency will increase. We see that today, standard and labeling has made a big move worldwide, and we basically can identify at least 75 countries, which basically represent over 80% of the world population, who has enforced standard and labeling as far as 2012, and these labels are progressing all the time. So that's obviously a very good sign, and demonstrate that the regulatory framework can have a huge impact worldwide. Another regulatory mechanism that is very well known is the building code approach, which basically set a minimum standard on the construction side on efficiency purposes. It can usually touch the insulation of buildings, but it can also touch the global performance of a specific type of building. And labeling programs, as in the standard and label, will basically reward high-efficiency building through recognition and will basically become a market-changing tool over time. You'll find that there's basically, like I said, two categories of these building codes. One is related to the thermal standard on envelope that you will see quite a lot in cold climates, but you will see it more and more as well in warm climates in order to reduce the need for cooling. And you will have code on envelope and equipment that will basically not only focus on the envelope itself, but also on the equipment side. So the global performance is targeted as a minimum requirement. It is applied to new buildings and major retrofits, and it basically makes sure that it is applied to the future set of buildings. It's pretty rare that we will see a building code that would address on a mandatory basis the building stock that is existing, because it would raise a lot of other issues. The main thing about enforcement, would it be building codes or other type of regulatory mechanism, is basically the enforcement aspect. So of course you can have regulatory framework that basically introduce concepts in a country and invite end users to adapt it, but basically the ones that are the most, the best effect are the ones that are enforced. And the main problem with the regulatory framework is not the design of these frameworks, which can be done at a relatively low cost for a country, but it's basically the enforcement aspect, which basically needs a lot of resources and a lot of financial capacity. And in most countries, developing countries essentially, where such regulatory framework are introduced, the main issue is enforcement. And as they have no capacity to structure themselves for such enforcement, the result of the regulatory mechanism become inefficient. And the regulation, even though if recognized as a valid one, would definitely not have the impact that was intended at the beginning. There's a lot, obviously, of other regulatory mechanisms that we cannot cover into this limited presentation. But I had to mention a few. Obligation for energy managers to be present at a certain number of facilities, would it be buildings or would it be industrial sites. And energy managers would basically have to issue reporting on energy users and actual action plan. And in some regulation, if targets have not been met, then penalties can be introduced. It's a growing mechanism as it involves direct human involvement in facilities and in targeting energy consumption. It does not rely on specific equipment. It does not rely on specific technologies. It basically relies on a process, which is one of the main aspects of energy efficiency, which is not always equipment focused, but a lot of time operational focused. We have a lot of countries who started to introduce that, some of them successfully, some of them not successfully. So a mandatory energy manager that doesn't have any obligations other than be present in a facility will often just be a mechanism that will not deliver the expected result. When you combine an energy manager obligation with efficient target, which would be another aspect of the regulatory framework, then obviously the results are a lot more impressive. On the mandatory target issue, a lot of countries start to mandate energy consumption reduction. One of the most famous one would be China, where they start with a certain number of the largest energy consuming companies and consumers and request a mandatory reduction of consumption, which obviously have a direct impact and generate savings. But there's a lot of other consideration, as obviously such a target will involve financing issues, will involve technical capacities of a company to comply, and we have to gauge the implication of such a mechanism, as it may end up with closing facilities, which will have obviously social impacts. So there's a lot of schemes related to these kind of targets that are starting to be considered, as a lot of the regulatory framework that has been introduced in countries demonstrated that they did not reach the expected results. Other regulatory framework could be the energy consumption reporting that we find in a lot of countries. Basically, that has an obligation for consumers to report their energy consumption. That does not by itself generate savings, but it mainly provides information on the government to help them develop the adapted framework, adapted mechanism, develop incentives that would basically help address the barriers in the market and refine the different actions that they can make to achieve their goals. Programs are also of initiatives that are introduced in markets to increase the energy efficiency. We can basically divide these programs in two big categories. The programmatic ones, what are basically touching everybody the same way, and the market-based approach, which is basically more initiative that enables the market by itself to develop projects and implement them. We have to understand basically two fundamental concepts related to programs. There's basically the resource acquisition one, and there's the market transformation one. And when you design programs, the difference between the two are fundamental. On the resource acquisition, it's basically based on providing support on the project that will be generating savings. And there's little concern about market transformation per se, even though both can be considered in the design stage. But it's basically addressing a project-by-project approach and generating a certain amount of savings. And it's usually focused on using incentives to provide to the market, so these kilowatt per hour or these cubic meters of gas or any other source of energy are happening. On the market transformation side, it's basically not focusing necessarily on grants and incentives, but it's designed not on a project-by-project basis, but it's designed on a long-term approach to basically introduce different technologies or operational behaviors that will basically alter the market and will change it to become, on the long term, a lot more efficient. And these concepts will basically have four different basic steps, would basically be identify the market barriers. A successful market transformation program will start with a very good identification of the barriers, which some of them seem obvious, but in the reality of each country, these barriers might be quite different. The second step is to assess the opportunities and leverage the different points. The third point is to develop and implement the market intervention that has been designed, and very importantly, to evaluate the program impact and to be able to adapt it over time. A successful program in market transformation will have an important impact at the beginning, but if you want to make sure that market transformation happens, you have to make sure that these impacts are sustainable over time and not just on a very limited time frame. The programmatic option basically can be seen as demand-side management or demand response program. They basically are focused on touching all a market segment, would it be the residential, commercial, institutional. They can be programmatic as well in type of equipment, but the concept is that they address a huge amount of end user based on a specific concept that we want to target or a specific market we want to focus on. And basically, it would have three main different approaches. The programmatic can start with innovation, so it may start with research and development that is not necessarily technology-based, I must say, but the research and development may be in management tools, it may be in a lot of different behavior mechanisms, and the research and development is basically to understand and develop the necessary mechanism that can be implemented over time. When you reach the step of penetration in the market, you basically can start with a voluntary approach where you basically have the most innovative consumer change their behavior, start to use different innovative equipment. So basically you have an immediate result without having to impose such a program in the market. But then at some point, if you really want to reach deeper into the market and not only target the innovators within it, you will have basically to reach a phase of consolidation where you will have mandatory implementation of these programs. And then obviously the program will have a lot more penetration rate. You would have programmatic approaches, like I said, that touch the behavioral components. So they may be used to obligation of training, of capacity building, of some specific targets in the market. And they basically are very concerned about sustainability. So if you change a behavior and you change it in such a way that it's going to be sustainable, then the savings that are going to be generated are going to be there forever. So like I said, they can introduce educational initiatives. Would it be at the specialist level, the management level, or even at the school level, where you basically change the behavior on the long-term basis? They can focus on specific approaches like energy audits, measurement and verification of savings and other that are needed in a sustainable market. Programmatic options can also include funding support for program. Basically, they are a very interesting alternative to subsidies that has been used quite a lot in market because it has been found that access to financing remains an important barrier even in markets that are flooded with subsidies. So subsidies reduce the return and improve the return on investment, reduce the initial cost, but they do not address the global barrier of access to financing. So we see on this side a lot of emerging schemes that are coming out of programmatic options, including the proprietary access clean energy, the PACE type of program, the unbilled financing of off-bill financing related to this aspect of funding. It would be too long to get into such details, but that could be the focus of another webinar. I assume if people would be interested in specific mechanisms that are gaining a lot of momentum in North America and in Europe mainly. The PACE program, I just included a slide to explain how it's structured, but it's basically developed at the city level or county level. It directly touches the homeowners and the people who live in a community, and it's basically using through their county to basically leverage the necessary financing by attaching it through the property itself, so reducing the risk of the lender. So that's a very interesting approach as far as financing that has been introduced quite a lot in the U.S. at this time, but has shown as well some difficulties, and there's some issues raised about the possibility to implement it through the legal framework that is specific to each region. We see basically that on these financial mechanisms, some will have high or low penetration rate. It depends if it's a voluntary or an obligation aspect. It can target a lot of different type of market segments. It will be designed, each them, to basically address different project size, and it will allow different consumers to adapt these mechanisms to their own needs. And the actual mechanism will basically be based on different repayment methodology that will be specific to each program and that will have to be adapted to each market. Improvement of program effectiveness, basically, yes, you would have programs that are introduced, but these programs cannot be static and they have to evolve over time. So as an example, at Hydro-Quebec in Canada, they have a program to basically bundle different initiatives that they started early on to basically become through a lot more comprehensive approach and not only on a single equipment approach. So a more comprehensive will basically have a higher impact usually because it's more flexible in its application and it makes the end user more interested because it fits more their needs without having a programmatic approach where it fits a specific equipment that people may not want to use or they're not using and it's not touching them. The best practice related to programmatic approaches is basically the use of program evaluation. Like I said, any program will have to evolve over time. It has to define its effectiveness. It has to evolve with the market, and the market will change based on a lot of things related to climate change in many countries where the cooling impact is increasing on a regular basis, or the cooling needs. You would have energy rates that will be changing. It will impact the consumer. So there's a lot of different variations within the programs that are changing. The other thing is basically the fact that program will have a certain penetration rate, and at some point you just don't want to subsidize people who would not need it because the market by itself should be sufficient to implement these projects. On financing, these kind of programs are increasingly developing because it's recognized that it's one of the major barriers. And so far, the programmatic approach didn't touch too much that aspect, so it's now recognized as probably the most important barrier in the market, even though the others are still present. And a financing program by say would not solve all these barriers in the market and will not transform it in such a way that we would achieve all the savings expected. One of the new trends in the programmatic approach is basically instead of targeting specific activities, which would be equipment, which would be financing, which would be any kind of mechanism that can be included in a program, they basically request intermediaries to find and identify and implement projects that would generate kilowatt hours or a specific amount of energy savings. So basically you can consider these programs as a supply side approach where instead of requesting actual savings or actual, energy supply through a thermal plant or through any other devices, you basically request to meet your needs by specific energy efficiency that would have to be demonstrated and that would become equal as a supply source than any other ones. At that point, governments make things a little bit more simple for them because they don't have to design and implement programs. They basically let the integrator take care of how best to address the market. And it's basically an approach that is in the middle between a fully institutional program, that is basically how we talk about programmatic approaches, or market mechanisms that are the different approach that we're just going to introduce here. Market-based mechanisms are basically ones that support intermediaries into the implementation of projects. One of such market-based mechanisms is energy performance contracting that we had the chance to present through a previous Leonardo-supported webinar. Conceptually, essentially, energy efficiency projects are quite complex. They're not necessarily complex in the sense that the equipment is innovative or not known, but basically because there's a lot of steps that will have to be implemented to implement even a simple technology. So you will need to have awareness, you will need to have knowledge, you will need to request the support of different actors, would it be contractors, manufacturers, government when there's programs available, financial institutions if you need financing. You will need sometimes to involve the supplier because it may change the way you will access energy. So all this becomes something quite complex, either in knowledge, either in time, and an EPC approach, an energy performance contract-based approach, will basically enable an intermediary, which is called an ESCO, an energy service company, to take care of all these aspects for clients and provide a lot of added value services, which would be the process to identify the savings, the actual design that is needed, a turnkey implementation, a financing option, the capacity to follow up the project over time, provide guarantees, and provide the necessary training and capacity building to make such a project sustainable for a client benefit. The energy performance contracting as one of the market-based mechanisms has been growing quite a lot over the last few years. It started basically in some countries, Canada, the UK, the US, but now it's mainly introduced in most countries of Europe and North America, and it's also introduced in a lot of other countries around the world. We see that as the growth of the market for energy efficiency, the energy performance contracting approach, which is called the ESCO industry, is one that will probably more than triple over the next few years as far as its use. Energy building codes will increase quite a lot as well as the standard and labeling. And obviously on that side that we see from the IEA, one of the growing aspects of energy efficiency is going to be in the transportation side, where not much has been done over time, but we recognize it's one of the highest consuming segment in the market and one that will have a lot of potential in the future. But we see that all these market-based mechanisms will basically play a fundamental role into the fundamental changes that will have to happen if we want to reach the targets that have been identified by some countries or identified worldwide to change the market so it's become a carbon less intensive economy. So we see that just some numbers on this energy performance contracting scheme as one of the most popular market-based mechanisms. We see that it's already existing, but we see that the growth is tremendous as a potential. And we see that some countries have not used it, even though we see that the potential would be great. So Brazil, India, and Indonesia are still not there, even though India is making a lot of progress in starting up initiatives that will grow that market significantly over time. As far as another mechanism that will be market-based, still using the energy performance contracting scheme, we have the super ESCO concept that is starting to appear because ESCOs, as energy service companies, are very often knowledgeable companies based on knowledge and based on technical capacities, but they lack the financial capacity to either provide the guarantees or the needed financing to address all the barriers at the client side so projects can be implemented. So what we see right now emerging is some kind of a super ESCOs, which are basically organizations that will link between the ESCOs who are able to develop the market, identify the projects, implement them, and the other organization, which is the super ESCO, which will be able to provide the financing and the guarantees needed for the end user to be incentivized to use that mechanism. So some of these new mechanisms that are emerging, we have EESL in India that is basically structured to be the biggest by far super ESCO that's been created right now, and the potential that it will address in India is incredible because there's a lot of capacities at the ESCO side, but a lot of gaps related to the financing. Etihad in Dubai is another one that's been created by a utility basically to address that market gap as well. And we have one through a program on FEMP in the US that's basically based as well on some kind of a super ESCO concept where it aggregates a lot of projects together, or FEDESCO in Belgium that is another one that's more institutional, creation by the government of a super ESCO that will basically enable projects to happen in the institutional sector, mainly addressing not only the financial issue but also the public procurement issue, which is always a barrier related to the use of market-based mechanism for energy performance contracting in the public sector. Market-based mechanism will need a lot of adaptation. Obviously the market by itself can operate and can implement projects, but when you want a program approach to be basically supporting these mechanisms, you will need to address a lot of the issues that may limit the use of such mechanism. As an example, related to EPC, you may have to adapt the legal and regulatory framework that we've talked about at the beginning to basically adapt it to the need of that specific tool. So for example, in the case of EPC, we will need to make sure that, at least on the public sector side, you have the capacity to have long-term contracting. And that's obviously something that is a big concern if you want major impact on energy efficiency, is the projects will have a longer payback if we want to achieve higher goals, and so you will need to have long-term contracting in any type of facilities. And as we know that the government may be a key partner in these action, not only because they implement policies and regulation, but also because they're an important end user as well. They will have to make sure that they can contribute to the energy efficiency promotion by having projects in their own facilities, and therefore enabling long-term contracting, which is sometimes not possible under regulations. You will have the private sector financing, which is also something that can be done, but not necessarily in a way that is of interest for EPC. And then you will have a lot of issues related to procurement, to taxes, that will need to be addressed to enable such a mechanism to happen at the public sector side. The other aspect will be the promotion. Well, if you want a market-based mechanism to be efficient, it has to be known by the market. It has to be known by the market and the end users. And in order to do that, an energy efficiency agency, a Ministry of Energy, or any other partner within the market may be used to basically increase the awareness, raise different standards so the market is well served. They can provide technical assistance and as well provide some additional financing to enable these mechanisms to work efficiently in a market. So basically, what we have to recognize is that policies, regulation, programs are among the available tools that can achieve the same objectives. There are different tools that are very often complementary. They can be used by themselves, or they can be used jointly. They can be very simple, so a policy can be only a general statement. They can be a lot more complex. A policy can address a lot more specific targets. The regulation as well we introduced through the webinar some of these mechanisms. There's a lot of others. They can be very simple again to design. They can be very complex in their nature because they would focus a very specific aspect. And when they're used jointly, there is a need, a fundamental need, to make sure that they are complementary and not working against one another. And that means that at the government level, when you try to have a global approach to energy efficiency, you need to have a holistic view of all this. You need to make sure that the programs and the policies not only are introduced, but they are revised on a regular basis. They make sure that they address the real barriers that are identified and are identified on a regular basis. And it makes sure as well that there's an important evaluation process to make sure that these policies, these regulations, and these programs are effectively addressing the market barriers that are evolving. Remember having talked to some people at the U.S. government who were saying that success does not come by the fact that the regulation is met by the most people, because if it was met by most of the end user, that would mean that the regulation and the objective is not met, because the market will stop to evolve. So you constantly need to look at these mechanisms, make sure as standards or as building codes that the minimum requirement is increasing, that the market is transforming over time, the behavior are changing, and then you can redevelop again these policies that will have to be revised over time, these regulations that will have to be adapted, modified, and improved, and the different programs that will be used to address the very specific aspect of each country or each market that has been targeted. We have to remember as well that government can use these programs by themselves through different agencies and different organizations that they have to implement those mechanisms, but they can also be delivered by the market itself, meaning that the market will become an ally in the implementation of these mechanisms and will obviously benefit from it at some point, but will become an agent of the government policies to enable the implementation of energy efficiency projects. It's important to understand that even though we presented some of these mechanisms, they are evolving over time quite a lot. And if we wanted to make some kind of a review of everything that's currently implemented as tools, I think it will be almost impossible, because the market the energy efficiency market is evolving at a very rapid pace, and it would be difficult to monitor everything as far as tools that are currently developed to develop that market. So as a last word, it's important to remember that each of these tools, would it be on the policy side, the regulation, and the programs, have to be adapted to each market. And what has been working in Europe may not be adapted to Africa, and what has been working well in North America may not work necessarily well in the LAC region. So every country and every market has to be analyzed, and there's definitely an investment to be done in these initial analyses that are the foundation of efficient policies, regulations, and programs. So I basically tried to cover very rapidly all these topics, and as we have an hour, I'm available for question and answer.